Greetings, everyone. My name is Nerea Hoff, Senior Marketing Associate at Campbell & Company, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our entire firm to Exploring Northwest Giving Trends, one of many webinars in our free webinar series. Today is September 13th, and we are broadcasting live from our new offices in downtown Seattle. We hope you're all having a fantastic day, and thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics, especially for those of you who may be new to our webinars. First of all, we'd like you to close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. We recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers, just a little bit better sound quality, and you can avoid feedback by moving your cell phone away from your computer. And if you experience visual issues, please send us a chat. There's a little chat box in your GoToMeeting control panel, or you can contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you'll earn 1 continuing education credit. That's good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. And yes, this webinar is being recorded. The follow-up email will also contain a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar, so please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will also hold time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to James Ford, Vice President here at Campbell & Company. James joined our firm in the fall of 2011 and was promoted to Vice President in 2016. The same year, he reached the milestone of 30 years, either working for or serving the nonprofit industry. He has both work and consulting experience in the healthcare, independent school, and higher education nonprofit sectors, and was most recently Executive Director of Development at Pacific Lutheran University before beginning his consulting career. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Nerea, and thanks everybody for coming. Sorry you've had to stare at my picture for so long, so let's move it over to our panelists. Really excited about the folks we've got joining us today. The first is Johanna. She's Chief Development Officer at Oregon Community Foundation. There she combines her love of both Oregon and philanthropists. She brings 26 years of development, almost hitting my milestone, Johanna, but not quite yet. Most recently is VP of Development at Mercy Corps and Director of Development at Reed College. At the Oregon Community Foundation, she leads a statewide team of highly qualified philanthropic advisors who help individuals and families create legacies of giving through donor-advised funds, scholarship funds, and testamentary gifts. Thanks so much for being with us, Johanna. I also want to introduce Lara Littlefield. She's Associate Vice President for Innovation Strategy at CoMotion and the Global Innovation Exchange. We'll learn a little bit about that when she speaks later. She also leads business development for both organizations. She has 20 years of experience in resource development and also oversees CoMotion's operations labs and innovation investment programs. Prior to CoMotion and GIX, Lara was Senior Director of Advancement at the University of Washington and was a principal here at Collins Group, the forerunner to our current name of Campbell & Company. And she's also the current president for the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Washington Chapter, Advancement Northwest. Thanks so much for being with us today, Lara.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
And then last but by no means least is Andy Price. Andy is Associate Consultant here at Campbell & Company. She is the one who conducted the critical research we used to develop this coming Northwest Trends report that we're highlighting in today's webinar. Before I hand things over to Andy to go over the report, it is available as a white paper. And I've got to say that the amount of research that Andy did to put this report together was amazing. It's worth reviewing for the footnotes alone. And really, I don't know of another document that exists anywhere that pulls together this information into one resource. So it really is something to look at, and it is a one-of-a-kind document. So thanks for all of your hard work in pulling this together, Andy. It really is a great piece, and I'm going to turn it over to you to share some of the highlights.
Great. Thank you so much, James, for that wonderful advertisement. I am so glad to be with all of you today and finally sharing this research with all of you. The first thing we're going to do today is we're going to start with a high-level overview of giving trends in the Northwest region. Then we'll take a look at specific trends that are impacting Alaska, Idaho, and Montana, and we'll talk with James about some strategies that fundraisers in those states can use to address those trends. And then we'll have a panel discussion with our speakers on the topics that are affecting both Oregon and Washington. So with that, we're going to dive right in. One of the first things we did when we were conducting our research on Northwest giving was we took a look at the giving ratio for the region. Giving ratio is a measure of all of the state's reported tax-deductible charitable contributions as a percentage of total gross income. The average giving ratio over 3 years for the Northwest region is 2.17%. That's the same as the ratio for the U.S. as a whole. Now, there is some variation among Northwest states, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but the Northwest is generally as philanthropic as the rest of the country, is the big takeaway from what we found. What's really interesting, though, is that in the last 3 years, the dollar value of charitable donations in the Northwest has grown 3 times faster than the dollar value of donations in the U.S. overall. Essentially, what this means is that even though folks in the Northwest are giving the same portion of their income to nonprofits, total adjusted gross income is increasing quickly. And so essentially, the piece of the pie is still the same, but the pie itself is getting much bigger, much more quickly. That's our general overview. We're going to take a look at Alaska. Although Alaska is the least populous state in the Northwest, the per capita rate of nonprofits is second only to Montana. The activities of Alaska's nonprofits account for an impressive 12% of the state's economy. Now, Alaska fared remarkably well during the Great Recession, only losing 0.4% of jobs in 2009. But due to recent low oil prices and a decrease in government funding, Alaska is experiencing a recession right now. But even before that current recession, the financial landscape began undergoing dramatic transformations. State tax revenues have fallen in the state by 90% since 2008. Federal grants to nonprofits have decreased by 31% between 2007 and 2013, and corporate and foundation grants are down by 20% since 2010. So what this essentially means is resources are scarce for many of Alaska's nonprofits. And at the moment, individual giving in the state isn't strong enough to help bridge the funding gap. Only 10% of contributed revenues reported by Alaska's nonprofits are from individual donors. This is a low figure by national standards, where the individual giving accounts for 19% of revenues. Alaska residents also report giving a smaller portion of income to nonprofits, 1.35% compared to 2.17% overall in the U.S. Given that Alaska is in a recession right now, it may not be feasible for many donors to step up their giving in this moment. But James has some strategies that nonprofits can implement now to address these shifts in funding sources in the future. James?
You know, when we looked at the situation in Alaska, what it reminded me of is some of the situation here during the Great Recession and what we counseled our clients at that time. And really, you know, it's a matter of starting with the basics and building a pipeline of engaged supporters. In the state of Washington and Oregon and others, you know, the corollary I would use is with our clients in the community college sector, really heavily dependent on government funding, and then all of a sudden that kind of dried up. So really, begin by bringing closer in your people that are already connected, building that out from the ground up, and using that as a way of increasing your donor base. Also, it's also important to note that in a recession, not everybody is suffering. There is always a group of donors that are a group of investors who are benefiting from whatever economic downturn is going on. So keep that in mind as well as you look to the future.
Great. Thank you, James. We're going to take a look now at Idaho. Based on giving ratio, Idaho is the most generous state in the Northwest. 2.6% of income donated to charity compared to 2.17% in the region. Generosity is especially pronounced in the median income bracket of $50,000 to $75,000. In this income range, Idaho residents give 2.05% of their income compared to only 1.5% nationally. The differences here may sound small, half a percentage or so, but essentially what this means is that the average Idaho resident will give $200 more to charity than the average US resident each year, which adds up to pretty big differences over people's lifetimes. We also found some other interesting things about Idaho's population, which James will share.
So some of the things that we found is that Idaho is really populated by many of the baby boomer generation, which I'm quite familiar with because it's my generation. And a lot of that is due to influx of retirees into the community. So when we look at that, also the urban areas are getting bigger. They're the second fastest growing in the Northwest. And as I said, more than half are 65 and above. One of the things that helped me think about is the book, The 7 Faces of Philanthropy. And when you look at the baby boomer generation, one of the characteristics is they're also called the Habitat for Humanity generation. You know, we, in my day, grew up with that Habitat for Humanity mentality of actually seeing what I'm giving to, touching it, feeling it, and having that sort of tangible connection. So to the extent that you can bring your donors into what it is that you're doing will be really, really important. And also, as folks are aging, you know, mortality becomes more and more of a front and center thing to think about. And so obviously, looking at planned giving, looking at how these donors can make their mark in their newfound community would be helpful, a strategy to consider as well.
Great. Thanks, James. Those are great things to keep in mind. Moving right along to Montana. Montana has the most nonprofits per capita in the Northwest, and 11% of those are environment or animal welfare related. That's a much higher rate than the rest of the Northwest and the country. It's twice the rate of animal welfare and environment related organizations in the Northwest, and 3 times the national rate. This is pretty interesting, especially when you consider how closely connected Montana's economy is to the land and natural resources. After a strong year of economic growth in 2015, demand and price adjustments in the energy and agricultural industries led to a notable slowdown in the economy in 2016. Analysts say that this trend has continued through 2017 and is likely to continue again in 2018. With recent volatility in the market, the average Montana resident may be feeling some financial uncertainty right now. And this is something we know can trickle into their giving behavior as well. So James is going to give you some ideas of what you can do now to help donors feel good about their giving decisions when finances are a little less certain.
You know, similar to what's happening in Alaska, what made me think about in Montana was I was at Pacific Lutheran during the Great Recession, and as I'm sure many nonprofit leaders have their own stories of how they managed that. What we really focused on were the students, you know, whose lives were being disrupted by this economic downturn, and the need being greater than ever to support them and help them achieve their dream of a college education. So I just would share that really focusing on the people that your nonprofit is serving who may be affected most by this disruption, and really putting the focus on supporting them and helping them through this time. And you know, what we find is that people do come together in the face of adversity to help others, whether it's a natural disaster, as we have a lot of experience with recently, or it's economic downturn, et cetera. So really, that came to mind as a focus. Again, in every economic cycle, there are always those who are benefiting as well as those who may be suffering, and finding those. And the obvious one in Montana is, and I don't want to be trite, but is there a connection to your nonprofit to the land, animals, or environment? I was talking with my wife the other day. She works in the healthcare industry in a hospice program, and she was sharing with me their pet therapy program. Now, I never would think of animals or land or environment when it came to healthcare, but there's an example of a type of a program that does have a connection to those things. So maybe look a little deeper, think a little harder, and just see if there might be a connection to what folks seem to be most interested in supporting in your particular area.
Great advice, James. Thank you. All right, we've arrived at Oregon. And one of the first things that we noticed when we started researching this state was that Oregon has the largest community foundation in the Northwest and the 9th largest community foundation in the country. That is why we've brought in Johanna to be part of this presentation. James has some questions for you today, so I'm going to pass it off to him, and we look forward to hearing your input on donor-advised funds in Oregon.
So I think we were somewhat surprised, if not shocked, to see Oregon at number 9. I think was there nationally. Nationally. And the size of the Oregon Community Foundation, and I can think of 20 other metropolitan areas that are twice the size of Portland and Oregon. So Johanna, I'm really curious about that growth and that size. Can you just give us a little idea of what that's about, what you might attribute it to the fact that OCF is so large in comparison to where it lives in Oregon?
Thank you. It is indeed surprising, I think, just given the population of Oregon, to be in this situation. What's unusual about the Oregon Community Foundation is that it is statewide. Many community foundations are city or region wide, but our founder 44 years ago was someone involved in the timber industry and worked with communities around the state. And when he started the Oregon Community Foundation with a modest gift of $67,000, his intention was that as the organization grew, it would really address all the needs of the state. So I think partially because of that, there's a real desire to help and influence Oregon in its entirety. People love the land here. People really are committed to the beauty of the state and seeing their communities thrive.
Thanks, Johanna. One of the other reasons why I was really eager to have you as part of this webinar is one of the trends that really transcends the entire region, if not nationally, is the giving to donor-advised funds. According to the most recent Giving USA report, the #1 recipient of charitable donations were donor-advised funds. And as a community foundation, that is a big part of your work that you do in securing those funds. So I want to ask you, what is your sense of the spike in interest in these giving vehicles? And in your view, has it really been a spike or a slow building over the years?
I would say for our community foundation, it has been a slow and steady building over the years. I think the spike probably has occurred with the proliferation of commercial donor-advised funds, the Vanguard, Fidelity, Charles Schwab donor-advised funds. People are being marketed every time they get a statement from their from those financial institutions about the benefits of donor-advised funds. So I really think that has amplified and spiked the interest more than community foundations. We've been at it much longer, but I think the spike really has a lot to do with commercial donor-advised funds.
And to that point, in previous conversations, and frankly in a previous webinar we did on Giving USA, we heard a lot of concerns from nonprofit leaders that that more donors are giving to donor-advised funds, and that as they do that, the converse is that the less they're giving directly to charities themselves, thus reducing the pool of dollars directly being given to them. I'm curious if this is a concern that you hear from nonprofit leaders in the greater Portland area, and any thoughts on advice you might give for how to best position themselves in this climate.
I think that I'll just say that the beauty of a donor-advised fund is that you know that donors have already committed money to the nonprofit sector. That's the good news about them. Sometimes there's a reason donors create a donor-advised fund if there's a particular tax issue they're trying to ameliorate in a given year. It's a way for them to commit money to philanthropy and to recommend grants over time. I think that, speaking at least from the community foundation point of view, our mission is really to get money into the community. We very much encourage people to use their donor-advised funds and help them in identifying programs they care about if they're not sure themselves. We have vast knowledge of the nonprofit community throughout the state, and we actually really try to match up donor interests with nonprofits. I used to be a director of development and wonder about whether, that very question, why aren't they giving to us directly? Why are they giving through a donor-advised fund? And what I can tell you is that I feel like I am having a reunion every day with donors I've worked with throughout my 26 years they give through a donor-advised fund, they also give individually. And I think it's just important for nonprofit leaders to recognize that the donors that care about their organization, just keep cultivating them. How they make their gift is their decision. It may be directly, it may be through a donor-advised fund, but it's really just important to continue cultivating and stewarding your donors, because the methodology they use to give is just one component of their desire to give.
That's great, thank you. Most of our, if not all the regions in the Northwest, if not nationally, have some form of a community foundation or community trust, as they used to be called. So my question is for you to give some advice. Let's say that, I'm a nonprofit leader in one of these states, and let's say that my organization is maybe providing nutritional support for children, or care for the elderly, or access to higher education. What is the best way to let managers of donor-advised funds, whether they're at a community foundation level or in another vehicle, know of the services I provide, so that you folks who manage these funds can be in the best position to make a possible match between a donor-advised fund holder and an area that those donors might be interested in investing in?
I think there are a couple things to do. One is that when I can't speak for all community foundations, but in Oregon, we have a community grants program, so that if, as a nonprofit, you are applying to the Oregon Community Foundation for a community grant, our team, our donor relations team, is very aware of all of those grant requests that come in. And whether or not OCF as an organization is able to make that grant, if that grant request is in an area that we know our donors, some of our donors are interested in, we share those grant requests with our donors. So we actually have a pretty robust database system where we know donors who are interested in early childhood, the elderly, arts and culture, you know, animal welfare, environment, and we are able to match up donor interests with grant requests that come in. That's one way we are able to kind of make that match. Additionally, we're in regular communication with nonprofits all the time. We are looking for those match opportunities, actually. So we do site visits. Our program officers, our donor relations officers are often doing site visits and understanding the needs of various nonprofits. On rare occasions, if a nonprofit's mission doesn't really align with the sweet spot of Oregon Community Foundation's priorities, which are all online, they can connect it with a donor relations officer and just, basically share with them what they're trying to do and check and see if there are any donors who align with that interest and mission. It's not the first place to go, but it is certainly an option. We're very much committed to supporting communities and the nonprofits in the communities in all sectors.
I think that's great, Johanna. I think that, that advice of just really being out there and sharing your message, as you said, even if it's not a direct fit, gives you the information you need to maybe share that more broadly. I think that, at least when I was in the nonprofit sector, I think that we always had a bit of a fear of approaching foundations unless there was a laser guided beam of connection between what we do. But I think you're right. I think Oregon Community Foundation, other community foundations are a little different in that regard, and that your mission really is to get those funds into the community and into the nonprofits that not only the community foundation is interested in supporting, but that your donors are supporting as well.
Exactly.
The last thing I want to ask you is, and this is something that I hear a lot, and I would help if you could address this. When nonprofits are in campaigns, the currency, the coin of the realm of a campaign is the 3 to 5 year pledge, right? We're always asking our donors to consider a 3 to 5 year pledge to support the campaign. There's concern that as more donors give through their donor-advised funds, that they cannot make a pledge specifically through the donor-advised fund, or that the donor-advised fund itself cannot be held liable or accountable to make a 3 or 5 or any year pledge, only a 1 year gift. So what's your sense of, is this something you hear as a concern out there in the community among nonprofit leaders, and how would you advise nonprofits in this regard?
Yeah, it's a tough one because it's not our rule. This came about through the IRS and the Pension Protection Act of 2005, where they perceived that making a multi-year pledge or committing a donor-advised fund to a multi-year pledge was, in fact, a benefit to the donor. Don't ask me to explain it. It's not something I can explain. What I can tell you is that we have many donors that recommend multi-year grants. And so, it may sound like a hair splitter at some level, and it all depends on how nonprofits are able to count, future gifts. But we do have donors who recommend multi-year grants to nonprofits that, we're able to honor. So that's one thing. It's something that we monitor. We don't police it. It's not as though, But I think what I'm trying to say is it's not our rule. It's, it's the IRS's rule. And so what we're trying to do is be compliant, obviously, to that. But I think there are ways that donors can, they can also make a pledge, and it doesn't necessarily commit the donor advised fund. They could make a pledge, and that pledge could come from their individual giving, So I don't know if that's helpful, but it's just important to know that it's not our rule.
Okay, well, we won't hold you accountable for rules that the IRS makes, so appreciate that. And I think I just want to amplify the last thing you said. Donor advised funds don't make pledges. Donors make pledges, and how they pay that pledge out is up to them in terms of where the funds come from. So both in my working with clients, but also when I was a frontline fundraiser, I would emphasize that point that we're asking the donor to make a 3 to 5 year pledge, and if they want to pay that out of their donor advised fund, that's great. But we're really looking for the donor to make that commitment. So thanks for that clarification, Johanna. Before we move on, is there anything else you'd like to add about the Oregon Community Foundation or the trends or landscape of giving in your state?
I guess what I'd like to say is that what we try to do is to really help people be more philanthropic. I mean, our goal is very much to amplify philanthropy throughout the state. And what we often do, we are not so much fundraisers really at the Oregon Community Foundation as we call ourselves philanthropic advisors. We're trying to help people make the largest commitment they can to philanthropy and to support the nonprofits throughout the state and beyond, actually. So I would hate for people to see the Community Foundation as a competitor of sorts, because what we really want to be viewed as, and what I believe we are, is a solid partner in helping nonprofits achieve their goals.
It's great, Johanna. Thanks so much, and thank you for your insights. And please stay on the line as we may get some questions in the future. But for right now, I want to turn things back over to Andy to talk a little bit about Washington State and some trends here that I think similar to what we're seeing at Oregon and the Oregon Community Foundation, maybe more amplified in Washington, but are somewhat indicative of the region as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, James. And thanks, Johanna, so much for your really helpful insight in the workings of your community foundation and donor advised funds, and how we can all work together to raise up philanthropy in our region and across the country. In Washington, like James said, we have seen a bit of a tech boom. Not a surprise to anyone who's living here, particularly those of us living in the Puget Sound area. But on paper, the numbers are actually still pretty staggering. The tech industry has grown 112% in the last 10 years. And that's not just in Seattle. There are many, many counties across the state that now have more than 1,000 tech professionals working in those counties. So we're not just being Seattle-centric here. This is a Washington-wide trend. And this has brought a lot of questions to the surface for fundraisers in this state, particularly how do we get these tech professionals involved in our mission, particularly because a lot of these tech professionals are not necessarily people who were born in the state. A lot of them have been residents of Silicon Valley who have relocated to the area because of the startup culture that we're starting to see. So these aren't necessarily people that have been engaged in the nonprofit scene in Washington previously. So this is a big question. It's a hard one to grapple with, but someone who spends a lot of time thinking about engaging tech professionals is Lara Littlefield. So we're so glad to have her on the phone today. And I know James has prepared some questions that he'd like to talk through with you as well.
We do have one clarifying question from the audience. Is that 112% in revenue or some other metric?
I'm sorry. Thank you for catching me on that one. In employees, workers.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And actually, this is very timely because Lara is coming to us live from and I know I'm not going to get this right, so I'll let you state what it really is. It's the Cascadia Corridor Conference, where there are a group of venture capitalists, educators, tech entrepreneurs, et cetera, all gathered to work on how to make this area even more attractive to tech workers. So maybe, Lara, if you could just, as part of background, just tell us a little bit about the Global Innovation Exchange at the University of Washington, where you work, and also about this conference and what it's hoping to accomplish.
Sure. Thanks, James, and thanks for having me today. It's exciting to be here, and I love that you described it as live from the Cascadia Innovation Corridor Conference, which is true. This is the second day. This is the second conference. It's annual. We had the kickoff last year up in Vancouver. The Cascadia Innovation Corridor is really a vision to connect our regions. It's Vancouver, Seattle, and all the way down to Portland, I might add, to really make this region a lot more globally competitive. And so it really is tackling issues around how do we make, borders don't seem to matter anymore, but how do we make our region, better connected, whether that's through startups, through new transportation modes, through, we have a number of elected officials here as well that's really trying to smooth out what that can look like. So it's exciting to be here, and there's been a number of great announcements which will continue to come. So my role with the University of Washington is split between CoMotion and Global Innovation Exchange. And I just might add quickly, so CoMotion is the collaborative innovation hub for the University of Washington. And our focus is really advancing the societal and economic impact of the university. It's how do we get, the great ideas that are being generated within our institution out into the community, making real impact. So we do that through innovation transfer, what is formerly known as tech transfer. We provide a lot of training, and importantly, we provide strategy for the university, because higher education is not exempt from disruption. So what are we thinking about in terms of the future of the educational model and what that means in terms of continuing to provide talent for a new innovation economy? And that's where the Global Innovation Exchange really comes into play. So this, there will be some big announcements tomorrow that we're excited about. We're launching the new program this week. But the Global Innovation Exchange it's a new educational program, and it's dedicated to building leaders for the innovation economy. So it's first and foremost, it's a partnership between the University of Washington and Tsinghua University, which is located in Beijing. We have strong foundational support from Microsoft. So this program goes beyond the traditional model of education. Instead, it's really focused on experiential, interdisciplinary learning that has a global lens. It's also team-based and project-based, and heavily involves industry in this equation. So our first degree is a Master's of Technology Innovation. That's what we'll be kicking off here in the coming weeks. And it's a new program that leverages networks. And this is the key component of an innovation ecosystem. And I think that we'll all be kind of thinking about this, particularly in the nonprofit sector, and how we're an integral part of that. But we're leveraging networks both from an academic side as well as industry networks. So tomorrow we're going to be announcing 8 new partnerships with top universities all over the world, as well as a new network of industry partners that are going to be bringing in kind of quote unquote real world challenges for our students to work on. So, there are no grades. It's very much an entrepreneurial startup type of program in which the students coming out of here will be able to lead teams in large institutions, in nonprofits, or creating their own startups. And we're very excited about it.
It's really, really exciting, Lara. Thanks so much for, again, for taking some time out of the conference to be with us. So as Andy pointed out, this mass influx of not only homegrown, but also from out of the area tech workers coming to our region. And, I think one of the things that's important is to note that, these aren't folks that are just coming to the Amazons, Microsofts, et cetera, whatever you would think is a quote unquote tech company. Really, more and more of what we might think of as old school industries are going through a tech transformation in order to remain competitive. And that's not just in Washington, that's region-wide. So this trend is going to be continuing, if not broadening. And so basically, I'm curious about, as these are your donor pool, this is your donor pool, if you will, as far as folks who might be interested in supporting CoMotion and GIX. Can you share anything with us you've learned about the philanthropic interests of this group as a whole, and how nonprofits might connect with this growing sector in our economy?
Sure. So it's a big question, a big, hairy, audacious question, James. Thank you. But I will just reinforce what you said, and I think that's been the theme of this conference. Every company is going to become a technology company, right? And so that is the lens in which we're all thinking in terms of industry. Starbucks announced, I think a few weeks ago that they are going to become a technology company. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, now sits on their board. We see Amazon buying Whole Foods. We see retail, needing to undergo a whole new level of transformation. So, I think that this is only going to continue to be the trend. I don't see it going back in any other direction. And I think that's a question for the nonprofit sector. How are we also technology-based organizations, and how we're using technology to better connect with our clients or our customers or our donors? So what does that mean in terms of philanthropic interests? I mean, I think it's hard to describe, this group as one homogenous set. I think we all know that best practices will still apply. Everyone is an individual with different interests, different passions. They're not exactly a pack. But I will say that there's probably a different kind of mindset, which is, important to keep in mind. If they're into tech, they're into building things, scaling, disrupting to achieve better solutions. And I think what we have found just in terms of trends, that it typically means people want to start something rather than giving to an existing organization or program. So you see new types of models emerging, like social benefit corporations. You see the Zuckerberg-Chan initiative in the Bay Area, which is really a tool for investing both in nonprofits as well as for-profit startup companies that may have solutions. The founders of eBay did something similar, creating the Omidyar network. So, I think that that's kind of something to think about. When you want to engage someone, just keep in mind that there's going to be most likely a tendency to want to do things a little bit differently. And so what does that also mean? That also means we need tight, succinct business plans that allow you to be agile and responsive as new challenges emerge. I think it's just kind of the way of the world. You kind of sit down and you poke holes through. That is kind of the entrepreneurial mindset. Let's poke holes through it. Let's pivot. Let's continue to improve and iterate as we move together in scaling, an effective solution to a problem. They are focused in problem solving, and that's the exciting thing, I think, for our sector, because that's all that we're focused on, right? That is our area of work. I will also just add that, I think you mentioned, it's a group that may tend to be a little younger sometimes. So years of experience from an organizational standpoint does not equate to effectiveness or even strength in their mind, right? You have to prove yourself a little bit on a different level. So I think that those are some just important kind of high level, overarching themes that I've noticed in my conversations. And of course, I've got a number of anecdotes for different types of individuals, that do things a little differently. At the end of the day, they're still going to have their individual passions. They're still going to be, loyal to the things that they care about and want to, make an impact in the areas that really make a difference for them.
Laura, that's great. And my connection, if you will, with folks who I would say would be more tech inclined is not as great as yours. But my sense is that, a lot of these folks approach life and their work you know, they want to change the world. I mean, they're looking at you know, how to do things radically differently or disrupt what's going on now for a new approach. And I'm just wondering if, as a nonprofit leader, you know, do our messages need to get a little more aspirational, a little more, you know, what are we in it for in the big picture, and where are we going in the big picture as a way of connecting? Would you affirm that, or how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's a certain type of methodology that's certainly kind of that a lot of entrepreneurs subscribe to, particularly as they're creating their pitches for investment in their startup companies, right? Which is a lean canvas methodology. So, you know, and I can talk more about that if there's interest, but I do think what it comes down to is, you know, you've got to get people excited and passionate about your vision, and you do want to dream big, and you do want to think about kind of all the potential that your solution provides, and then you got to be able to back it up, right? That I think is, you know, we can talk big, but you have to have a solid plan behind it that you can really demonstrate that you are an expert in this area. And that's where, you know, I see a number of pitch sessions out there, and you get people excited about the vision, and then the next stage is let's poke holes in your business plan to make sure that this is a viable solution and business model to invest in.
That's great, and I think it shows some flexibility on the nonprofit side that you need to be open to that as well. Getting to your point earlier, you said that, you know, conventional wisdom, it says this group tends to be younger, and I think, you know, again, conventional wisdom says it probably is more male than the typical philanthropist. So my question is, do you find this to be true? And whether it's true or not, how would you describe this group in general? Are they philanthropically minded? Is it something that is sort of the education curve is steep in order to get these folks to realize the importance of the nonprofit sector? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I mean, of course, yeah, it's definitely more male. That is just, you know, you look at the numbers, and that's just kind of where the sector is currently. I tend to work both, you know, with those in the technology sector, but also in the investment community from the venture capital and angel investment side. And that just, you know, study numbers will show that that's male, pretty male heavy. But, you know, going back to your, you know, that's just the reality of where it is. There's a lot of effort to improve diversity, both in the STEM fields. You know, that's a huge conversation right now in this area, but you know, that's also a big challenge, I think, in the investment community. So that's just something to keep in mind. Going back to your question, though, of, you know, are people philanthropically minded? I can just tell you my experience, right? And again, I think it goes back to everyone's a little different. And I think that the rules of, you know, the kind of what we have seen in terms of studies of, you know, people becoming baby boomers being a little bit more philanthropically inclined as they're hitting a certain stage in life doesn't necessarily apply in this group. I have worked with, you know, 20-something-year-old CEOs of startups in the Bay Area who graduated from college when they were 16, and they're ready to give back at this stage. And they just want to know how to do it, right? And they're excited about it and eager to do it, which I think is like wonderfully inspiring to me. I think sometimes I will say, in my experience, some of the harder challenge, you know, more of the challenges around engaging folks in a philanthropic conversation tend to be more of those investors, right? The angel and VC investors. And that is, you know, you have to start where people are at and work with them and kind of lead them along the way and educate them as you go. And so we have, luckily, in the programs that I run, we have, you know, incubators with startup companies that they, you know, a number of investors are interested in learning more about and potentially investing in. But then I also get to show them, you know, we have a innovation fund, which is philanthropically supported, that is kind of the pre-seed to becoming a startup. Until you start to work your way up the chain. This is, what philanthropic funding can do to get to larger outcomes where they're professionally interested. And then, if that's of interest, you can lead them even further up the chain as to why research is important, why our faculty and our students are important, that allow for these great ideas to be generated and that support all of our ecosystem, in the community. So that's just where we're at today.
That's great. Thank you, Lara. It's great insight. I think we're at the point of our time where we're about 10 minutes left to go here, so we're gonna handle some questions for our panelists and for myself and Andy. And Nerea, do you wanna kick us off with maybe some that have come in?
Great, thank you, James. Yes, we have a question about what we were just discussing. Lots of techies are from other countries like India and China. How are those immigrants philanthropically? Are they different? Do they need a different approach? What's your sense? Lara, that's probably for you.
Yes, I think this is a whole nother webinar. And to see.
Great, we'll sign you up for that one as well, Lara.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm predominantly working with China right now, and I will say that it is absolutely different. It tends to be more transactional. I think philanthropy is a little bit more nascent in terms of how we know it and how we interact with it. But that doesn't mean that it's not happening. There actually is a number of investments that are happening from companies into more from a corporate social responsibility standpoint. And a great person to talk about this is also Colleen Willoughby from the Washington Women's Foundation, who has been convening women in China, particularly around this topic. So that might be just a little seed to plant with you guys about the next webinar, because I know she's been doing some great work in this area and would have a lot more to say on it.
Hey, Johanna, I'd like to bring you in on that one, because certainly this trend is not exclusive to Washington. Have you found that you're using any different strategies or finding any more interest with people in your marketplace who maybe have immigrated from other countries, or what's your sense of that?
Well, I think that Lara's right. It is, I think people from different countries come to the idea of philanthropy from a different place, and it often starts with their families, especially if their families are still in other countries, or, with their communities back home, whatever back home might be. That said, we have a huge interest in helping diversify our donor base along all lines as well. And I think we have found when people understand how we can be relevant to them, it creates an entree for a conversation to us. So when they see that, for example, that OCF is making grants to organizations they care about, whether it's an Indian dance group or a Native American cause, that helps people understand how philanthropy works, like people give and then communities get. And so I think it's always about being relevant, and as you said earlier, starting where you are with people you know and having them help you, having them help us introduce us to their networks.
That's great. That's great insight, Johanna. Thank you both.
I would like to mention too, this is Lara, that for those higher education folks on the phone, that our firm recently did a research study and report on international giving, and that's available on our website.
Great, thank you. Anything else coming in,
Yeah. This is probably mostly for Johanna. Are donor-advised fund donors spending down the corporates, or mostly just giving from interest earnings?
Good question.
Yeah. It depends. It depends. We offer two types of donor-advised funds. There are donor-advised funds that are endowed, in which case the folks give from the interest earned on that endowment, and the goal there is to have a donor advised fund in perpetuity. We also have what we call wholly expendable donor advised funds, which means that the donor is able to make grant recommendations for the entirety of the donor advised fund. So it just depends on what the donor's goals are in setting it up and how they perceive they want to use that fund. So both of those options are available to donors.
Johanna, if you had to just give and I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you say, as far as those two kinds of funds go, is it 50-50? Is it 60-40 toward more one fund than the other? What's the prevalence of each of those kinds of funds, would you say?
I would say that donors, in more recent times, I would say in the last 5 years or so, have a greater interest in creating wholly expendable funds. I think this sort of speaks to the younger generation of donors, whether, you know, when I say younger generation, I'm thinking about baby boomers on down. They want to have access. They want to have access to those funds. And as they get older, they may actually convert them into an endowed fund. But I think it gives them more flexibility. And frankly, I think the Oregon Community Foundation was sort of less open to that in the earlier years. So it's a smaller percentage that are creating wholly expendable funds, but I'm expecting that to grow.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question from the audience, and it could be for any of you. Can you give some advice or direct us to resources for how nonprofits can articulate their relevance and aspirational vision in a better way to attract donors? Most organizations start with what they do, not why they do it.
I mentioned, this is Lara. I mentioned the lean canvas methodology earlier, and I just wanted to kind of share that it has kind of 9 steps to it, and I find it to be really useful from a case development standpoint, but it's also a business plan tool. And really, the first step is just understanding the problem you're trying to address. So most of us start talking about solutions or the how of what we do, and it's really just convincing people that there's a problem first. The second phase is really understanding who your customer is, because we can't all be everything to everybody, but you can demonstrate that you're being very thoughtful and targeted in your approach. And then the question is, why is it your organization is different, or why you're the one to be partnering with on the, solution to the challenge. And then you talk about the solution, right? Yeah. After that, it's getting people up to that point. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but just so that our audience knows exactly what you're talking about, when you say, I'm hearing lean, like L-E-A-N, and canvas, like something you paint on. Is that the name of this system?
Yes, that's exactly it. And
if I were to Google that, would I find information on it?
You will. You'll find several charts. You'll find different articles about it. It tends to be, the methodology that's used most often with entrepreneurs.
That's great. That's great info. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Any final thoughts about that?
No, it goes on into detail, but I think that, again, just knowing it's not the how that we talk about, it's one, convincing people that there's a problem, and then getting to the solution. Yeah.
Great, Lara. And not only are we doing another webinar, but the audience has now signed you up to teach a workshop about lean canvas approach to case development.
He was provided you with a sidelight now, Laura. That's great.
Great. Thanks.
Great.
Can I just
Yeah. Go, Johanna.
Okay. I think Laura's totally right. The only thing I would add is that too many organizations try to explain too much, and I just think we tend to be very verbose, and we're trying to get everything down on paper, and people are not that interested. I would just say keep it short and simple and pique their interest enough to actually have a conversation, because the goal is to have a conversation with people. And this is OCF included. We're trying to explain too much, and I think donors want their interest piqued and want to learn more if we present it clearly.
Johanna, this is Lara. I couldn't agree with you more, and you also just reminded me that one of the things I failed to mention was, you know, when I meet with entrepreneurs or investors, it's never more than a 30-minute meeting because we can't waste their time. So you have to be ready to be succinct in exactly what you're saying.
Well, speaking of being verbose, our time is up. So, Nerea, any other final thoughts before we sign off?
Well, other than saying thank you so much for coming out today, I think you know, one of the things I've learned from this presentation is that even though we were talking about these really 5 distinctive states that have different trends, a lot of the information really applies in different ways across the region, even though they're felt more acutely in certain states. And it's just such a rich amount of information, and we're really excited to share the Northwest Giving Trends Report with you. You'll have a link to that in your follow-up email on how you can download it. It's free, and thanks to Andy for all of her hard work on researching that. So on behalf of Campbell & Company, we'd like to thank you again for joining us today. If we didn't get to your specific question, please feel free to shoot us an email. We hope you'll also take a moment to fill out a very short survey about your experience today that will pop up on your screen as soon as the webinar ends. Takes a minute. And we also hope you'll join us for other webinars in our free series. Coming up on September 28th is Activating Broad-Based Support with Giving Tuesday and Crowdfunding. Yes, Giving Tuesday is right around the corner. I can't believe it. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Lara and Johanna, just fantastic to have you here. James, Andy, everyone who made this happen, and of course, our audience for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and have a great day.